Hello for keys. Today I'm gonna show the theory in the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann defense. So Caro-Kann defense starts after removes 1 e4 controlling the center, and now black plays this move pawn to c6 known as the Caro-Kann defense. And of course with this move pawn to c6, black is trying to play the move pawn to d5 on the next turn, striking at the white center. And now white has few choices, but the best move is to play the move pawn to d4, grabbing a lot of central space, and after d5, of course, black is attacking white's e4 pawn, and now white has a lot of choices, but today we'll take a look at the move pawn to e5, known as the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann defense. And of course, with this move pawn to e5, white is grabbing a lot of space in the center of the board, and black will try to attack white's center in the near future, of course. And now black has only two choices. Either you play the move bishop to f5, the main line, or you play this tricky sideline with the move pawn to c5 on the third move of the game. And of course this is free pawn. White can take this this pawn on c5 of course. And after d takes c5, now black has two choices. Either he will play the main move with move pawn to e6, attacking the c5 pawn, or he will after d takes c5 play the move knight to c6, attacking the e5 pawn. And after knight to c6, the theory goes bishop to b5, of course pinning the knight to the king on e8, therefore the pawn on e5 is defended, and after e6, attacking the c5 pawn, now white plays the move bishop to e3, defending the pawn, and after knight e7, of course trying to play the move knight to g6, attacking the e5 pawn once again. This knight to e7 is very good move, particularly in the advanced variation is seen a lot. And after pawn to c3, trying to play something like knight to e2 and then knight to d4. Of course, this c3 move controls the d4 square once again. And after bishop to d7, bishop c6, bc6, excuse me, knight takes c6 is the best move. And after f4, g5 is the best move, of course, f4 defending the e5 pawn. And this very aggressive g5 move is trying to take the control over e5 pawn. And after fg5, knight e5, you can see this position is very good for both sides. Knight f3, queen f3, bishop g7, and after white castles, this is the main position of the Botvinnik Carol's defense. Of course, after remove castles from white, white is putting pressure on this f7 pawn, and you can see that this pawn on g5 is very weak, and now black will simply castle or play the move rook to f8 and will have great position. But of course after d takes c5, e6 is the best move in the position, and after the move a3, black is simply saying that he will take the pawn, but white will play a3 followed by b4 and will get a lot of tempi for the taken pawn. So after bishop takes c5, b4, bishop b6 is the best move, and after knight f3, simply developing and defending the e5 pawn. Once again, after knight e7, you can see this is very common idea in the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann. Knight e7, trying to play knight to f5 or knight to g6 as seen before. And after bishop d3, knight g6 is the best move. Indeed, after castles, knight to c6, bishop b2 simply developing and defending this e5 pawn once again, because after knight e6 the pawn was attacked, of course. And after black castles, rook e1, f6, ef6, and after gf6, you can see that black stands great here, I believe, with this a lot of central control, with these three pawns being on f6, e6, and on d5. Maybe e5, and e4 is common playing in this position, and of course white position is good as well. He has a lot of space on the queen side, of course, but I believe white is slightly better, and that after e5, bishop to f5 is the best move if you want to play the advanced variation with the black pieces correctly. So after bishop f5, now this is bread and butter of the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann, and of course there are many different lines in the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann. The main line is knight to f3, this is known as the short variation. There is knight to c3 followed by g4, known as the Van der Wiel attack. There is also h4, the tiled variation, trying to trap this bishop being on f5. There is of course knight to e2 as well, trying to play knight g4. This is known as the Bronstein variation. And there is this move bishop to d3 as well. This is the most bad of them all, the most bad move of them all. And of course after bishop d3, queen d3, after e6, black has amazing position. He will play c5, he will develop this knight to c6 of course, and will have at least equal position. So after knight f3, c5, c3, knight to c6, after white castles, cd, cd, and after knight g to e7, once again trying to play knight to f5 or knight to g6, black has amazing position, and after knight c3, knight to f5, pressuring the d4 pawn. Maybe queen b6 will be played in the near future. Black will play bishop e7 and will castle, and this bishop to d3 variation is at least equal for black, if not even better. So we will continue with the move knight to e2, the Bronstein variation, and after knight e2, e6 is played, of course trying to develop this bishop with this move e6. Black is simply saying he will develop this knight. Maybe he will play c5 in the near future, will play knight to c6, and will attack this d4 pawn as well. So after e6, knight g3, of course attacking the bishop, and black doesn't really want to allow to take this bishop with the knight from g3 to f5, of course. So bishop g6 is the best move. Now there is this crucial idea of the Bronstein variation, very common in the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann as well, this move h4. And of course with this move h4, white is simply threatening to play h5 and trap this bishop on g6. And now you might ask, what is the best move? Black has two choices. Either he will play h5 or he will play the move h6. Of course making sure that the bishop has a room to go to h7. So h5 is the best move, but after h6, black is kinda worse because allowing h5, bishop e7, bishop d3, queen d3 is not particularly good because now white has a lot of space on the king side. He will play c3, bishop e3, knight d2, and will probably castle long and will have a lot of attack on this poor king on e8. Therefore, after c5, c3, knight c6, now you can see that white actually castles, and this is another idea of this Bronstein variation with h4 followed by h6. He will play the move f4 and f5 and will take back with the knight and will have amazing position. Therefore, the move h6 is not particularly good, allowing to play the move h5 from white. Therefore, h5 from black is the best move. Of course, with this move h5, this queen and knight are both pressuring this h5 pawn, but black is fine. Black is at least equal in this variation. So after h5, there is this move bishop e2, pressuring this pawn, of course, and after c5, now black sacrifices this h5 pawn, and after c3, knight c6, bishop e3, of course, this pawn was under attack if white were to take this h5 pawn. Therefore, after queen b6 attacking the b2 pawn, white doesn't really have time to take this h5 pawn because this b2 pawn is attacked. Therefore, queen to b3 is the best, and after c4, queen b6, ab6, you can see that black has this semi-open a file and this a2 pawn is kinda weak, and black will play b5 followed by b4. This is an idea from London system as well with the move queen b6, and I think this position is better for black, and this is actually the end of the theory in the Bronstein variation, and I don't really recommend you to play this if you are white. I recommend you either to play this move h4, knight c3 or knight to f3 that I'm going to show you right away. So h4 is sideline as well, but this is known as the tile variation. This is very aggressive way to play against the bishop to f5 in the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann defense. And if now black were to play the move e6, after g4, bishop e4, f3, bishop g6, h5, this bishop is simply trapped. Therefore, e6 cannot be played in this position after h4, but the best move in the position is to play h5. This is actually the only move. Why? Because after h6, g4, this is not as good for black. White has a lot of space on the king side, will play f4 and f5, of course. then this bishop will be really bad. Therefore h5 is actually the only move. And now white has two choices. Either he plays the move bishop to d3, which is the main line, or he will play the move c4, threatening to take the pawn on d5 and have amazing center in the board. So c4 is the sideline, and after c4, e6 is the only move, of course overprotecting this d5 pawn. And after knight 3, kind of putting some pressure on black center. Knight e7 is the best move, of course, with the idea of going to g6, or maybe even once the bishop moves to f5. And after knight g to e2, knight d7 is the best move, maybe preparing to play the move pawn to c5, or maybe playing b6 and pawn to c5 later on. And after knight g3, bishop g6 is the best move. Of course, the bishop was attacked from this knight from g3, and after bishop g5, queen to b6 is the end of the theory. But of course, something like queen to c2, excuse me, not queen to c2, but queen to c1 can be played in this position, maybe even queen to b3, opening up some lines for this rook from a1. And this position is fairly balanced, and I recommend you, if you are going to play the tile variation with the move h4, to play the main line with the move bishop to d3. You will have amazing positions if you are white, and if you are black, you shouldn't be really scared of this, because after bishop d3, queen b3, queen d3, excuse me, and after e6, you have a very solid position. And you can argue that this pawn on h4 is very weak, therefore this pawn on h5 is good as well. And this pawn on h4 is target for the queen from d8, and this queen has already moved to d3, therefore the h5 pawn, excuse me, is not as weak as h4 pawn. And after e6, bishop g5 is the best move, and after queen b6, knight to d2, white is sacrificing this b2 pawn, but you cannot really take this pawn. Why not? Because after queen to b2, rook b1, queen a2, this pawn is simply hanging with a lot of interest. And of course, something like rook c7, putting pressure on this pawn, putting pressure on the back rank, is not particularly good for black. Therefore, you cannot really take the pawn on b2 if you are black. You should play the move pawn to c5, of course threatening to take the d4 pawn. And after move c4, striking at the center, you have to play the move queen to b2 now. Why? Because after rook b1, this pawn on d4 is hanging. Therefore, after queen b2, you cannot play rook to b1, but you should play the move rook to d1 if you are white. And after knight to c6, knight to e2, knight to b4 is the best move. And this is very tricky for both players. And after queen f3, knight to c2, and after king f1, you can see that white has lost castling rights. But this queen is a bit of a target, of course, maybe with the move rook to b1. Once this pawn will be protected with some other pieces as well. And after knight to d4 from black, knight d4, queen to b3, you can see that queen to b5 is threatened, of course, with checkmate. And after bishop to e7, not allowing any checkmate ideas, now that f8 square is released for the king. And this is the end of the theory in the tile variation, the main line of the tile variation, of course. And black has two extra pawns, but after something like queen to b5, king f8, and this pawn is of course hanging, and this position is fairly good for both sides. And of course white has a lot of attacking potential, but if black will be solid, he might survive the attack and will be up a pawn. Therefore this h4 move is very aggressive, and if you like attacking chess, then you should really play this tile variation of the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann defense. But there are two other moves, of course knight to c3 and knight to f3. Of course knight to c3 is the Van der Wiel attack. This is kinda a bit of a sideline as well, with an idea of course of playing g4 on the next move. And after e6, g4, bishop g6, excuse me, knight g to e2, with the idea of knight to f4, c5, the theory goes h4, of course threatening to trap the bishop with the move h5. And after h5 from black, you can see that this pawn will be sacrificed from black, but he will get a lot of initiative for the pawn. So after knight f4, of course threatening the bishop and attacking the pawn, you cannot really allow to take the bishop with the knight. If you are black, you should play bishop h7, and after knight to h5, you should play the move c takes d4, and after knight b5, trying to take back with the knight. I had recently an overboard game with this position, and I managed to draw it with the black pieces, but I didn't really know what I was doing. But after knight to c6, knight takes d4, knight g to e7 is the best move, and after c3, a6, not allowing any bishop to b5 ideas. Of course, after bishop to g5, this is the end of the theory, but you can see that you will play rook to c8 if you are black, and after something like bishop to e2 maybe, you will trade, and then you will play knight to c6 and bishop to c5, and you will have amazing position. You will castle, and these pieces for, excuse me, not, of course not knight to c6 because your queen is hanging, but in some positions, maybe after queen to d7 and let's say white castles, you can see that now black has amazing position, and this king is not particularly safe on the queen side as well. So if you will face knight to c3 from the black side, you should know that you should sacrifice this h5 pawn if your opponent will play g4 on the next move. But of course, knight to f3 after remove bishop to f5 is the best move. After knight to f3, this is the most positional variation of them all, and after knight to f3, e6 has to be played, and after bishop to e2, now black has three choices. Either he will follow the main line with the move pawn to c5, or he will play either knight to d7 or knight to e7. So after knight to e7, white will simply castles, and after c5, of course, this pawn cannot be really taken because after knight g6, this pawn is attacked, knight to c6 will be played later on, and this pawn will fall as well. So after c5, c4 is the best move, and you should remember that you never take the c4 pawn in the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann defense if you are black, but you should play knight b to c6, putting some pressure on the d4 pawn, and after d takes c5, d4 should be your move, and this is the end of the theory. But you can see that black sacrificed this c5 pawn, but after something like, I don't know, rook e1, which is not the best, but after knight g6, this pawn is very good, this pawn will fail, this pawn on c5 is weak as well, and black has amazing position, but this position is good for white as well. Maybe even something like, I don't know, h3 followed by g4, and this position is good for white as well. And knight to d7 is a little bit better for black, and after white castles, knight to e7, knight b to d2, and after h6, knight b3, g5 is kinda the starting position of the theory in this variation. This variation is very deep. A lot of games has been played on the highest level of chess, and you should study this variation if you are going to play knight to d7 against the short variation of the Caro-Kann. But after bishop to e2, the short variation, I recommend you to play this pawn to c5, the most straightforward variation in the short variation of the Caro-Kann advanced. And after bishop e3, c d4, knight d4, knight to e7 has to be played. Of course, retreating this bishop to g6 is kinda the waste of a move, therefore knight to e7 is better, and after knight to f5, knight f5, black has amazing position, and you shouldn't really take the bishop if you are black. You should, after knight to e7, you should play the move knight to d2, trying to play knight to f3 in some positions, or even knight to b3 later on after the move c3 is played. And after knight b c6, excuse me, knight 2 to f3 has to be played, and after bishop e4, white simply castles, and after knight g6, trying to put a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn, knight to c6 has to be played, of course, not allowing to take this e5 pawn, and after b takes c6, this is the end of the theory in the short variation as well. And after something like c3, bishop d3, white will have good position, but I think this position is very good for black as well. He will play c5, maybe he will play d4 as well, with a lot of attacking possibilities. This bishop is really good, this knight is pressuring this weak e5 pawn as well, and maybe after something like queen to c7 or queen to b6, after the bishop is gone from this diagonal, black will have amazing position. And if you are white, you shouldn't be scared to play the move e5 on your turn here. The advanced variation is really good if you're white. You should be studying it a lot because a lot of players with the black pieces will know what they are doing, and you should be prepared for this c5 bot winning Carol's defense if you are white, but you will come better out of the opening. And if you are black, you should be happy to play against the advanced variation. This is bread and butter of the Caro-Kann defense. So if you like the video, make sure to subscribe to follow more such content, and see you guys in another video.